The Siege of Recife, 1630, when the Dutch tried to seize the sugar capital of the world. In the early 17th century, Brazil was the shining jewel of the Portuguese colonial empire. Along the country's northeastern coast, the province of Pernambuco, centered around the towns of Recife and Olinda, had become the richest sugar-producing region on Earth. The sweet white gold of sugar flowed from these plantations into European markets, enriching Lisbon and fueling Portugal's maritime power. But a new rival was rising in Northern Europe, the Dutch Republic. Having broken away from Spanish rule during the long and bloody 80 Years' War, the Dutch sought to challenge the Iberian monopoly over global trade. They were not content to merely trade, they wanted to conquer. And in 1630, the Dutch West India Company launched one of its boldest colonial expeditions ever, a massive assault on the Brazilian coast, culminating in the dramatic Siege of Recife, a battle that would change the history of Brazil forever, and give birth to a short-lived Dutch colony known as New Holland. Background: the War for Sugar and Empire. By the late 1620s, the Dutch West India Company, West-Indische Compagnie, or WIC, had become a powerful private military corporation with a royal charter to wage war against Spain and Portugal across the Atlantic. The Dutch had already seized key bases in the Caribbean and along the African coast. But to truly strike at the heart of Iberian wealth, they needed to capture the sugar ports of Brazil. Pernambuco was the prime target, a land of fertile soil, sprawling sugar mills known as engenhos, and a coastline dotted with rivers that carried the sweet cargo to the sea. To control Pernambuco was to dominate the global sugar market. At that time, Portugal was under Spanish rule through the Iberian Union, 1580 to 1640. This meant that attacking Portuguese colonies was effectively attacking Spain itself, perfectly aligned with Dutch wartime objectives. The Dutch had already tested the waters. In 1624, they briefly captured Salvador da Bahia, the capital of colonial Brazil. Yet the triumph was short-lived. A year later, a massive Luso-Spanish fleet recaptured the city. Still, the Dutch learned valuable lessons. They now understood the weakness of Portuguese defenses and recognized the strategic value of Recife, the deep-water port of Pernambuco. The Dutch invasion of 1629 to 1630. In the summer of 1629, the WIC prepared its largest expedition yet. A fleet of 65 ships, carrying over 7,000 men, was assembled under the command of Admiral Hendrick Corneliszoon Loncq, a veteran of many naval campaigns against Spain. The mission was clear: seize Recife, conquer Olinda, and establish a permanent Dutch foothold in Brazil. News of the fleet reached the local Portuguese governor, Matias de Albuquerque. But he had little time or resources to prepare. His garrison consisted of a few hundred regular troops, local militia, and armed settlers, brave but poorly equipped compared to the professional Dutch soldiers and their naval artillery. When the Dutch fleet appeared off the coast of Pernambuco in February 1630, the defenders knew they faced overwhelming odds.
The fall of Olinda and the Siege of Recife. On February 16, 1630, the Dutch began their assault, landing troops along the coast north of Olinda. The defenders resisted fiercely, but the firepower and coordination of the Dutch proved decisive. Within days, the Dutch captured Olinda, forcing the Portuguese to retreat inland. Admiral Loncq then turned his attention to the real prize, Recife, the bustling harbor city that handled Pernambuco's sugar exports. Recife was strategically located, built on narrow strips of land and connected to a small island called Antonio Vaz. While its geography made it ideal as a port, it also made it extremely vulnerable to a combined land and sea siege. After days of bombardment and intense fighting, Recife fell on March 3, 1630. The Dutch raised their flag over the city and secured its warehouses, docks, and fortifications. In a matter of weeks, the most valuable port in the New World sugar trade had changed hands. Portuguese resistance and the guerrilla war. Despite losing Recife and Olinda, Matias de Albuquerque refused to surrender. He withdrew his surviving forces to the interior, where he built a fortified camp at Areal Vejo do Bom Jesus, about 10 kilometers inland. From there, he organized a relentless campaign of resistance. Albuquerque's men, a mix of Portuguese soldiers, local settlers, indigenous allies, and even African slaves, waged a guerrilla war against the Dutch occupiers. They attacked supply lines, ambushed patrols, and harassed any attempt to expand Dutch control beyond the coast. For the Dutch, used to fighting disciplined European armies, this new form of warfare was a nightmare. The tropical heat, disease, and unfamiliar terrain crippled their campaigns. Although they held the major coastal towns, the interior remained firmly in Portuguese hands. The WIC soon realized that holding Brazil would be far harder than conquering it. The birth of New Holland. After their victory at Recife, the Dutch proclaimed the creation of a new colony, New Holland. The Dutch West India Company appointed administrators to oversee trade and fortifications, turning Recife into the colony's capital. However, control remained fragile. Dutch forces dominated the coast, but the hinterlands were alive with insurgency. Portuguese partisans attacked sugar mills, sabotaged roads, and undermined Dutch authority at every turn. In the following years, the Dutch tried to consolidate their colony by sending reinforcements and governors. The most famous of them was Count Johan Maurits of Nassau-Siegen, who arrived in 1637. Under his enlightened administration, New Holland experienced a brief period of stability and prosperity. Maurits modernized Recife, built bridges and canals, and even invited artists and scientists to document Brazil's people and nature. Yet beneath this veneer of progress, resistance simmered. Many Portuguese landowners refused to cooperate, and the WIC's harsh taxation alienated the local population. When Portugal regained independence from Spain in 1640, the resistance against Dutch rule gained new strength and legitimacy.
The Long War for Brazil. The Siege of Recife marked only the beginning of a two-decade-long struggle. From 1630 to 1654, the Dutch-Portuguese War in Brazil raged across Pernambuco, Paraíba, and beyond. Both sides suffered heavy losses, and the sugar trade, once the lifeblood of the region, was thrown into chaos. For the Dutch, the colony of New Holland became an expensive and uncertain venture. The WIC, already stretched thin by wars in the Caribbean and Africa, struggled to supply and defend its Brazilian outpost. As profits dwindled, investor enthusiasm faded. Meanwhile, the Portuguese regrouped. After 1640, freed from Spanish domination, Lisbon sent reinforcements to Brazil and mobilized a determined counteroffensive. In a series of fierce engagements, most famously the battles of Guararapes in 1648 and 1649, Portuguese and Brazilian forces defeated the Dutch armies and reclaimed Recife after a final siege in 1654. Thus ended the Dutch colonial experiment in Brazil. Consequences and legacy. Though short-lived, the Dutch occupation of Recife left a profound impact on Brazil and global trade. The Dutch learned valuable lessons about the sugar economy, later applying them to colonies in the Caribbean such as Curaçao and Suriname, which became major centers of the sugar and slave trade. For Portugal, the victory was a matter of national pride and survival. Retaining Brazil ensured the continued flow of wealth that would sustain the Portuguese Empire for centuries. The Siege of Recife also symbolizes the early modern world's brutal race for resources, where empires clashed not just for land, but for control over the commodities that powered the global economy. Recife today, echoes of a forgotten war. Modern Recife stands as a vibrant metropolis, known for its canals, culture, and carnival. Yet beneath its colorful streets lies a legacy of conquest and resistance. The forts that once guarded its shores, the churches rebuilt after sieges, and the old Dutch canals still whisper the story of 1630, when a small coastal city became the battlefield for global empires. The Siege of Recife was not merely a colonial skirmish. It was a clash between two visions of empire, between ambition and endurance, between profit and patriotism. It was the spark that ignited decades of conflict and reshaped the colonial map of the Americas. And though the Dutch ultimately failed to hold Brazil, their brief rule left behind a fascinating chapter in the history of the Atlantic world, one written in the blood and sugar of Pernambuco.